The two Musungus walk up and down the dusty road. They need to find a ride. Around them, the bustling city of Kisangani is alive with people going about their day. The Congolese metropolis, which used to be called Stanleyville, is home to more than 1.5 million people. This is deep in the heart of Africa. This is where Joseph Conrad's famed novel, Heart of Darkness, takes place. It's the former innermost trading post during the horrifying reign of King Leopold II. One of the white men, a young guy with a goatee, is carrying a large green duffel bag, and he keeps it close to his body as he somewhat nervously looks around. They stand out. In a sea of indigenous locals, they're the only pale faces in the parking lot that day. Finally, they see a white Toyota Land Cruiser. They agree it's big enough to transport them and their broken down motorcycle through the jungle. But the two men are not happy with the price that the driver is asking, and they get even more angry when he tells them there will be two other passengers in the car as well. The two white men, however, have no other options, so they agree to the terms with the driver. And that evening, they all pile into the beat-up truck. It's going to be a long drive. Most of eastern Congo is a vast primordial rainforest, controlled by a number of different rebel militias. But they need to move on, so one of the palefaces gets in the open back next to the two Congolese passengers. They have to scoot closer together because their white Yamaha motorbike is strapped down in the back as well. The other white man gets in the front next to their chauffeur, and then they start to drive. In 2009, two young men working as private military contractors in Sub-Saharan Africa cross into the Democratic Republic of the Congo. They hire a local driver, but their journey soon comes to a dramatic end. This is the story of Norwegians Joshua French and Tjostolv Moland, who in 2009 were convicted by a Congolese court of the murder of 47-year-old Abedi Kasongo earlier that year. Before we get started, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any future uploads. Let's get on with today's story. Tjostolv Moland and Joshua French both had a history of serving in the Norwegian Armed Forces. They likely first met when they were both serving in the Telemark Battalion, a mechanized infantry battalion of the Norwegian Army, where Tjostolv reached the rank of second lieutenant. In 2007, they were both forced to leave the army, however, after they faced allegations of recruiting military personnel into employment with private security companies. Tjostolv soon founded his own security firm called Special Interventions Group, or SIG for short, and Joshua French, who was half British, quickly joined him on assignments in different conflict zones around the planet. The young Norwegians subsequently worked as security guards in several places, including protecting a Korean company against piracy in the Gulf of Aden. They also took part in security missions in a number of African countries, such as Angola and Sierra Leone, and eventually they began operating a facility in Uganda, where they trained locals in basic military skills. There is actually footage from this facility, which documents the program that local recruits would undergo.
Why are you always the fucking slowest one, huh?
But they had a problem. Business wasn't great in Uganda, so Tjostolv eventually needed to reconsider their options. And that's why he decided to reach out to a man named Laurent Nkunda. Nkunda was the head of a Rwandan-backed rebel group called the CNDP, which in English is short for the National Congress for the Defense of the People. Nkunda was essentially a Congolese soldier turned warlord of Tutsi descent, who in 2009 was arrested in the Rwandan capital of Kigali, where he remains in house arrest to this day. Under Nkunda's leadership, the CNDP had been accused by the United Nations and the Congolese government of numerous atrocities, and Amnesty International has claimed that his troops have abducted children as young as 12 and forced them to serve as child soldiers. In the early 2000s, while the Second Congo War was ravaging the nation, Nkunda was accused of massacring more than 150 people in the city of Kisangani. and his soldiers were accused of murder, rape, and pillaging of civilian villages. But despite all of this, Tjostolv seemingly thinks General Nkunda may be a potential customer. The CNDP began a campaign in the North Kivu province of the Democratic Republic of the Congo in late 2008, and they faced a combined party of Congolese government forces, other militias, and a UN contingent that numbered more than 17,000 troops. Presumably, Tjostolv knew that General Nkunda would be happy with any help he could get. When Ugandan authorities later raided the hotel room that Tjostolv and Joshua had stayed in before they had left for Congo, they confiscated his computer, and on this computer, they found a message that Tjostolv had sent to General Nkunda. The message read as follows: "We wish to offer you our services and our support, Mr. General. I have formed a picture of you as a highly intelligent and well-educated person. Therefore, I know that you will appreciate Europeans supporting you in your intelligence work, because Europeans are unlikely to cause suspicion." Whether or not General Nkunda responded favorably when he received the message from Tjostolv and Joshua is not entirely clear. What is evident, however, is that in May of 2009, Tjostolv and Joshua decided to travel west from Uganda and cross the border into the North Kivu region of the DRC in search of work. Let me pause for a moment. Before I go any further, there are a couple of things I want to emphasize about this case. The more you hear about this story, the more obvious it seems that there are essentially two directly contrasting narratives surrounding this murder, and that's where this episode may feel a bit polarizing. African and international sources tend to paint a picture of Tjostolv Moland and Joshua French as two privileged and entitled Europeans who thought they were above the law. Meanwhile, Norwegian sources heavily lean towards the idea that Tjostolv and Joshua were indeed wrongly convicted. They had simply been at the wrong place at the wrong time, and the trial had been a poorly executed display of the judicial process in a developing nation. So what does this mean for our episode today? First of all, I want you to remember these differing perspectives as I tell you about the case, because my goal is not to persuade you of what I think really happened. Frankly, I don't know what the real story is. I will try to pick my words carefully and simply present you with the facts of the case as I understand them. So if you feel at any point that I am trying to skew the story in one direction or another, please know that's not my aim. Secondly, I am from Denmark, and this case was not reported on very much here. However, in Norway, the case was obviously much more significant. That's why I would be eager for anyone who may feel there is more information to add to share your opinions beneath in the comments. Especially if you happen to be from Norway, or if you have a better grasp of how the story was truly perceived in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. This brings us to May 5th, when Tjostolv Moland and Joshua French are traveling by car through a remote area together with a driver and two other men. Presumably, they are on their way to inquire about more work with one of the warring factions in the region. What really happened that day is highly disputed, but the one fact that's certain is that near a town called Bafwasende, around the 109-kilometer marker on the Ituri road that runs from Kisangani to the Ugandan border, the driver Abedi Kasongo is murdered. Tjostolv and Joshua would later claim in court that they had been ambushed by a militia or bandits. They had stopped briefly so the Norwegians could relieve themselves in the bush. So when the gunfire starts, they managed to flee into the jungle. But Abedi, the driver, had been struck by bullets from the bandits. However, the other two men that had been riding in the car with them had a different story to tell. They claimed that at one point Tjostolv had pulled a gun on Abedi Kasongo and begun to threaten him. The two other passengers had fled as Abedi was shot and died while still seated in the car. Again, what really happened is not quite clear, but these are the two opposing stories that have persisted to this day. Either Tjostolv and Joshua witnessed their driver's untimely death at the hands of trigger-happy militia members, or they are themselves cold-blooded killers. But whatever the truth is, they decided to flee into the jungle after the incident. Whether they were guilty or not, they likely realized their chances of reaching the Ugandan border and fleeing the country were higher than convincing the authorities they weren't to blame for the murder. They head east, allegedly waiting for help to arrive from some of their contacts. But 4 days later, Joshua French is arrested by the authorities somewhere inside the Ipulu Wildlife Reserve. And 2 days later, police catch up with Tjostolv Moland as well. When they were arrested, Congolese authorities found Norwegian military ID cards, fake United Nations military caps, and employee ID badges, some with their correct names on them, but others using fake aliases. Some of these employee badges were from Tjostolv's company, Special Interventions Group. Joshua French had traveled under the alias John Hunt, while Tjostolv Moland had used the alias Mike Callan. They discovered that the two Norwegians had been staying at a hotel called the Riviera in Kisangani, and when they raided it, authorities confiscated at least one rifle. The Norwegians also had a camera on them containing images of Joshua and Tjostolv on their recent travels around the area. One of these images proved to be particularly interesting. While it is believed to have been taken by Joshua, it shows Tjostolv smiling as he is washing what is allegedly the blood of their driver, Abedi Kasongo, from the inside of the car they'd been driving in. Despite this damning evidence, Joshua and Tjostolv reaffirmed their claim that Abedi Kasongo had been killed by the gunmen they had encountered along the road. But remember, the two Norwegians had not been alone in the car with their driver. I mentioned before these two other passengers. These people, Gina Kepo Ayla and Kasimo Arajabo, testified in court that they had indeed been present during the killing. They would go on to claim that Tjostolv had shot Abedi Kasongo, while Joshua had attacked Gina, whom he had tried to kill, and at least 3 shots had been fired during the scuffle. Gina Kepo Ayla and Kasimo Arajabo, however, had managed to flee the scene. Their testimonies have been heavily criticized, however. The Death Penalty Project, an NGO that provides free legal representation to those facing the death penalty, asserts that both Gina and Kasimo had been paid to appear in court, but also that the prosecutors failed to disclose key evidence against the defendants, leading to a largely unfair trial. In addition to Abedi Kasongo's murder, the two Norwegians are also charged with the attempted murders of the witnesses, espionage, armed robbery, and the possession of illegal firearms. The trial was eventually scheduled for August 14. There was later some debate as to the legitimacy of the proceedings, because the Norwegians were tried before a military court. This was permitted because firearms had been used in the crime. Normally, however, only Congolese police and soldiers are able to be tried before a military tribunal. When the news of their arrest made it to Norway, the story was immediately picked up by the media, and eventually the Norwegian Foreign Minister, Jonas Gahr Støre, had to comment on it publicly, stating that people had to be realistic about what the Ministry of Foreign Affairs could actually do.
I have the following statement to make. I consider this court, unfortunately, a political farce, and I'm not going to participate verbally, only physically, in this trial from now on.
A representative from the Norwegian embassy did oversee the trial, but Norway's government had no legal recourse, as it was a Congolese criminal matter. And eventually, on September 8, 2009, Tjostolv and Joshua were found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death. It had been a fairly high-profile case in the Congo, and perhaps because of this, the court ordered the Norwegian government to pay a $1 compensation to each Congolese citizen, which would total more than $60 million. Although initially the Congolese claims of compensation had amounted to more than $500 billion. The Norwegian government quickly denied that the two young men had been involved in espionage. Like I mentioned, Tjostolv and Joshua had previously both served in the military, and the local police did indeed find Norwegian military IDs on them, but otherwise there is little to suggest that they still reported to the Norwegian authorities. Despite this, however, they were also found guilty on this charge. The conviction was immediately appealed, however, and in April of 2010, it was actually overturned due to the flawed procedures at their military tribunal. All this achieved, however, was a second trial, and once again, they were found guilty of both murder and espionage. Again, they were sentenced to death, while the Norwegian state was ordered to pay $65 million in compensation. Capital punishment still technically exists in the DRC, but at the time of their conviction, the most recent execution had been carried out 7 years prior, and there's effectively been a moratorium on complying with these sentences since 2003. Because of this, capital punishment has most often been commuted to life imprisonment. So when Tjostolv and Joshua are convicted for a second time on June 10, 2010, for all they know, they are looking at a lifetime behind bars in a Congolese prison.
Da skal vi ha et portrettintervju med Dr. Joshua French. Og vi skal ta fore bekjempelsen av mygg, kakerlakker, gresshopper og rotter på cella.
Initially, Tjostolv and Joshua remained jailed in Kisangani where the trial had taken place. But in 2011, they are moved to the military prison in Dolo in the capital of Kinshasa. Mata Zweit, a Norwegian author, did an article for the website Africa is a Country in 2020 in which she explored the case thoroughly, and I will post a link to this in the description. And since I'm going to be referencing this article a couple of times, I will post a link to this in the description. She mentions that Tjostolv and Joshua seemed to do relatively well in prison at first. Supposedly, they hung a sign up outside their prison cell that read Leopoldville. Now, if you don't know anything about the history of European colonization in Sub-Saharan Africa, let me give you a much too simplified rundown. Colonial rule in the Congo began in the 1800s when King Leopold II of Belgium established a colony in the then largely unexplored Congo basin. After obtaining the support of a number of Western countries, Leopold achieved international recognition of the Congo Free State in 1885. But over the next few decades, the violence and ruthlessness employed by Free State officials against the indigenous people in the area led to intense diplomatic pressure on Belgium to take official control of the country, which it did in 1908 by establishing the Belgian Congo. The capital city, which is now known as Kinshasa, was first established as a trading post in 1881 by famed explorer Sir Henry Stanley and named Leopoldville in honor of his employer, King Leopold II. Colonization was devastating on the native population, especially during the time of the Free State. Economic exploitation meant the effective oppression of the indigenous Congolese, while Belgian national and private interests prospered. Under the direct rule of Leopold II, the region transformed into a humanitarian disaster. Millions of people likely died from the lack of immunity to new diseases introduced by contact with European colonists, such as the influenza pandemic of 1889 and 1890. But perhaps more horrifyingly, the stories from around this time of the corporal punishment that locals would endure were devastating. Exporting natural rubber was a major source of revenue to the colonizers, and the failure to meet the rubber collection quotas was punishable by death. The local militias were required to provide the hand of their victims as proof whenever they had shot and killed someone, but in order to save ammunition, they would often simply cut off the hands of indigenous workers, leaving them to either live or die, which resulted in a large part of the population being horribly disfigured. Eventually, this is what caused Leopold II to allow an International Parliamentary Commission of Inquiry entry to the Free State in 1904, and subsequently, due to public pressure, the king lost direct control of the colony. The country that would become known as the Democratic Republic of the Congo finally gained independence during the early 1960s, and as mentioned, the city of Leopoldville was officially renamed Kinshasa. Obviously, this brief history lesson has absolutely nothing to do with the lives of two young Norwegians born much later in time. But even though it's been over 50 years since the founding of the DRC, it's easy to understand why Congolese locals would be fairly displeased when Tjostolv and Joshua put up a sign outside of their cell, naming it after the capital of the former colonial nation. And going back to the article by the author Mata Zweit, she mentions that the two young Norwegians seemingly shared, and I quote, a romantic nostalgia for the bygone era of white colonial Africa. Initially, they managed to stay fit and healthy for a long time, and they had access to better food and supplies provided by their supporters from outside of prison. These included their families, especially their mothers, who frequently made trips to the Congolese capital to support their sons. A number of charity organizations also aided them, including a Christian organization back in Norway, which organized donations in support of the two prisoners. As the years went by, a very public campaign in Norway kept the pressure on the Norwegian government to not falter in their backing of the Norwegian nationals. But despite all of this support, the situation for the two prisoners did eventually begin to deteriorate. At one point, Tjostolv wrote a letter confessing to the murder of Abedi Kasongo, but when he read it aloud in court, it was clear he was severely ill with malaria, so his friend Joshua and many others dismissed this confession on the grounds that Tjostolv had been delirious. Many also continued to criticize the trial over the subsequent years. Guillaume Liquela, who had served as the defense attorney for Tjostolv and Joshua, said that the verdict had been problematic considering the Norwegians had not been given a capable interpreter for the trial, which had been conducted in French, which neither of the men spoke. A number of people also made the observation that Tjostolv and Joshua's, and I quote, unprofessionalism and amateur behavior were indicators that they were indeed not foreign agents, as the prosecutors had claimed. An advisor to a former Norwegian prime minister, a man named Øystein Merum, even went as far as to call the two men idiots. According to a 2009 story in the Swedish newspaper Dagens Nyheter, Much of the evidence against the two men has also largely been described as contradictory and seemingly absurd. At one point during the trial, the prosecutor supposedly took out a picture of a man wearing a beret and pointing at a map of Africa in relation to the espionage charges, claiming it to be a picture of the commander in charge of Tjostolv and Joshua's mission in the Congo, only for this man to be later identified as a photographer from a regional Norwegian newspaper. A former political advisor to the UN peace mission to the Congo is quoted as saying that it appeared sufficient evidence existed to convict the two men of the charges and that the trial had been procedurally correct. But this person also went on to say that considering the rule of law in the country leaves much to be desired, the conviction should be taken with a grain of salt. At the end of the day, whether or not the trial had been fair, there was honestly little the Norwegian authorities were realistically able to do in order to help Tjostolv and Joshua. And perhaps this is the reality that dawns on them over the next few years, which may have contributed to gradually shaking their will to survive. Tjostolv, who during the proceedings had seemed a bit more dominating than his friend, begins to especially feel the effects of being imprisoned in the Congolese capital, and his health eventually starts to decline. And this leads us to 2013, when the case takes another decisive turn. On the night of August 18, 2013, Joshua is sleeping in his cell. The two friends both normally wear earplugs to block out the myriad of sounds that emanates at all hours from an African prison. But around 4 a.m., he still wakes up with a nagging feeling. Joshua notices immediately that Tjostolv is not in his bed, and he has no idea how long he has been gone for. Alarmed, he glances at the cracked door to their small bathroom, and slowly he creeps out of bed. When he turns the corner, he immediately sees the deceased body of his friend. 4 hours later, when the prison officials make their first rounds of the day, Joshua notifies them, and an investigation begins. A Congolese minister states in the next few days that the authorities are still trying to determine whether Tjostolv's death had been a suicide or a murder, and I quote, "It does indeed look as if the man had taken his own life, but they are not sure of it yet." Meanwhile, back in Norway, Tjostolv's family is notified of his passing, and the Norwegian foreign minister announces the death publicly. Additionally, the government dispatches a 4-person criminal team to assist the investigators in Kinshasa. It didn't take long after Tjostolv's death before rumors began to suggest that Joshua was to blame. Joshua stated to the media that he was happy with the arrival of the Norwegian investigators, but a DRC spokesperson, General Major Tim Mukuntu, asserted that while the Congolese government approved of the Norwegian participation, the DRC would still be in charge of the investigation. In December of 2013, Congolese authorities charged Joshua with the murder of his friend. They claimed that Joshua had drugged Tjostolv prior to strangulating him, and these allegations were soon met by immense skepticism by the Norwegian police. The Norwegian investigators had already reached the conclusion that Tjostolv had committed suicide beyond any doubt, but despite this, Joshua now found himself facing another murder trial. He was found guilty and handed a second death sentence, and now Joshua's health began to decline as well. Tjostolv had been a good friend to him, and it's easy to imagine that the two men had partially been keeping each other sane while enduring the mental toll of being in a Congolese prison. Eventually, he got so ill that he had to be hospitalized for some time. He was moved to a safe house outside of the Ndolo prison. This did provide him with somewhat better conditions, but it was also around this time that Joshua started to think about escaping. The DRC is immediately bordered by the similarly named Republic of the Congo. The capital of this other country is called Brazzaville, and it is located directly across the Congo River from Kinshasa. Joshua knew that his best opportunity to escape would be to reach the other side of the river, then make his way to a Norwegian or other European embassy in Brazzaville. So one day he sneaks out of the safe house and staggers his way down to the riverbank. Still suffering from his poor health, he begins to look for a way to cross the river. In this area, the Congo River is at least a mile wide, so it's not as easy as simply swimming across. But while he looks for a means of egress, an employee from the Ndolo prison passes by on their way to work, and this person easily recognizes the pale Norwegian. Joshua is returned to his safe house, and he likely realizes that trying to escape will be futile at this point. But as fate would have it, his trials would soon come to a conclusion. After serving 8 years in the DRC, Joshua is released on May 17, 2017. The next day, he returns to Norway. The official grounds for his release were publicly attributed to health and family concerns. The process of having him extradited to Norway began weeks prior, but it wasn't announced until the plane carrying the man had finally landed on Norwegian soil. Likewise, the Norwegian Prime Minister didn't call Joshua's family to inform them of the good news until he had boarded the airplane. They had gotten close to securing his release before, and no one wanted to get his mother's hopes up in case the Congolese changed their minds. Upon returning home, Joshua was hospitalized and treated in isolation for a number of infections caused by multi-resistant bacteria. Finally, in August of the same year, he was released from the hospital, and to this day, he still resides in Norway. Joshua has always asserted that he and Tjostolv were innocent of the charges they'd been convicted of. When he got back to Norway, he was a free man. In later years, he has toured his country giving talks to sellout crowds about both his time in prison and his travels across Africa. And in 2018, a movie about the case was released with some of Norway's most famous actors. Interestingly, it stood out to me during my research for this episode that virtually very few Norwegian sources seem to question Joshua's innocence. I am not saying they should, but I probably expected to see a couple of articles with a slightly more critical approach to the case. It seems the vast majority of news outlets have easily dismissed the Congolese tribunal as a farcical display of judicial malpractice, while the prosecutors and judge had already decided the outcome of the trial before it had even begun. Personally, I have a hard time forgetting about one piece of evidence that played a significant part in the ruling. The picture of Tjostolv Moland wiping the blood away from the front seat of Abedi Kasongo's car. Honestly, this picture proves nothing, but Tjostolv's smile is bone-chilling. Let's say you choose to believe their story of what happened. It's still impossible to imagine what made Tjostolv grin from ear to ear while he wipes the blood away. During the trial, they explained that as former soldiers, they are trained not to react to great distress with fear, but almost laugh it off and block it out. And supposedly they had taken the picture because they wanted a record of what the car had looked like immediately following the incident. When he had taken it, Joshua had said something that made Tjostolv smile as a way of making the situation less tense. Whether or not this is the truth, Joshua himself is likely the only person that knows. Norway and the Democratic Republic of the Congo are two nations that couldn't be more different. And I will go back to the article by Mata Zweid one final time. She points out that the case left a bad taste in the mouths of many people, and I quote, "There are questions that we may never get the answers to. Why is Joshua French walking free when there is mounting evidence that both he and Moland conducted paramilitary missions that may have contravened not only Norwegian law, but the laws of various African states, as well as international conventions and laws? Why was there such a reluctance on the part of the Norwegian public to believe that the two were guilty of anything but an innocent boys' trip that veered a little off track in Africa? Why did we expect an independent nation in which the two had committed a crime to disregard its own judicial system and return the prisoners to Europe? Why does the same concern not apply to foreign nationals imprisoned in Norway? Why are French's public speaking appearances so popular? Why the focus on the criminals and so little on the victim, who left behind his devastated wife, small children, and extended family? And finally, she asks, what is so special about French and Moland? I wanted to repeat this paragraph because frankly these questions perfectly sum up why this case is so complex. It's been said that the international struggle for the release of Joshua French included at least 3 Norwegian prime ministers and 4 foreign ministers, 2 Nobel Prize winners, several bishops, a large number of Norwegian politicians, and at least 18 members of the European Parliament. It has also been estimated that the public resources devoted to securing Joshua's freedom amounted to at least 4 million Norwegian kroner. There is an interesting article that was published by GQ that put out some additional claims as to what Tjostolv and Joshua were really doing in Kisangani. A British ex-soldier whom Tjostolv had briefly employed in Uganda in the months prior to the murder claimed that the Norwegians had been hired by an unknown client to rob a bank in Kisangani. This is why they had UN uniforms with them. There were thousands of UN troops stationed in the city at the time, and if they were dressed the same way, Tjostolv supposedly believed it would be easy to walk into the bank and rob it without facing too much resistance. But hold your horses here. If you want to read more about this, check out the article. I honestly don't want to dig too much into this, because it largely seems like an unsubstantiated story from an unknown source, and it seems inappropriate to talk much more about this without more context. Again, this case remains controversial because of the pair of starkly different narratives that persist to this day. When you learn about the case, it's impossible to not form your own opinion of what probably happened. And of course, I have mine too. But I hope that you found this story fair. At no point was it my aim to tell you what really happened that day in 2009, because I literally have no idea. The only one who does is probably Joshua French. But whatever the real story may be, perhaps the best way of ending this episode is not to point fingers at a cold-blooded killer and tell you who did it, but rather spare a moment in memory of the man who definitely shouldn't be forgotten, which is Abedi Kasongo, who left behind a family when he was murdered. This is it for today's story. If you don't want to miss our next episode, make sure to subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications. And while you're at it, I would enjoy hearing your opinions on the case, so feel free to leave a comment beneath, especially if you have more knowledge of the story and feel there was any major information I left out. Thank you for watching.